In the early months of 1995, the construction of an underground bunker was completed in Yasny Polony, within the Kirov region of Russia. This project was the brainchild of Alexander Komin, who, alongside his accomplice, Alexander Mikhaev, spent 4 long years building this hidden dungeon below a garage. Komin's heinous scheme involved forcing women into slave labor within the confines of this dungeon, in which they were also held as prisoners for years at a time. Motivated by a desire to get rich through the exploitation of his captives, Komin's vile aspirations extended beyond mere financial gain. He envisaged creating an insidious underground kingdom. In this dark realm, enslaved women would be forced to give birth to his offspring, creating generations of slaves, all bound to serve and idolize him as their ruler. A truly perverse vision. This case is truly shocking. It's one that's bleak, twisted, and cruel. I'm going to give you a warning now. This is a rough one. But before we dive in, if you find this video fascinating, then please drop it a like and leave me a comment below. And if you are new here, then please hit the subscribe button and consider following me on Instagram. It all really helps. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse or condone the criminal actions described within. On the evening of July 21st, 1997, in the small town of Polany, Russia, a disheveled blonde-haired woman stumbled into the local police station. Her clothes were torn, her face pale with exhaustion, and her hands were trembling as she spoke. She told an officer that for the past 6 months, she had been held captive in an underground dungeon. She said she was forced into slavery, beaten mercilessly, and forced upon many times. She told them that she had witnessed fellow inmates suffer brutal punishments, with others even being murdered. But as she told them of her nightmare, the officer taking her statement was skeptical. He dismissively said to her, "You need to stop watching so many horror movies." What she said next stunned the officer. One by one, she began listing the names of 5 people who had all been reported missing over the past few years. In a town as small as Polany, such a number was staggering. The officer's expression shifted from amusement to shock as he realized she was naming real people, real cases, ones they had long assumed were dead or simply vanished without a trace. The woman identified herself as Irina Ganushkina, another missing person, presumed gone forever. But she was here, standing before them, living proof that something truly horrific had been happening in their town. Then, with shaking hands, she pulled out a photograph. It was a picture of her captor, the man who had built the underground dungeon, the man who had stolen her freedom. The face staring back at them was that of 44-year-old Alexander Komin, and suddenly, the officers believed every word. Alexander Komin was born on July 15, 1953, in the town of Polany during the Soviet era. Raised in a working-class district, his parents were labourers, but life was good. His early years were calm, ordinary, almost forgettable. Academically, he was neither exceptional nor troubled, blending into the background as just another student. But he was anything but the average person. Inside him, something was brewing. By the time he reached 8th grade, Komin had already decided he was done with formal education. He saw no future in it, no purpose. He had no real passion for anything. But one thing that did excite him was a career in the military. Determined, he abandoned school and began the enlistment process. He passed the necessary examinations, ready to begin a disciplined, structured life as a soldier. But just before his new career was about to begin, he took a totally different path, one that would eventually lead to a series of horrific crimes. On the brink of joining the military, Coleman got into a bar fight with his friends against a group of other men. The fight was brutal, and in the aftermath, 2 of the men they were fighting had been stabbed. They were in critical condition. Coleman and his group of friends were all tried equally, although we do not know who stabbed the men. At just 18 years old, Coleman's dreams of a military career were crushed. Instead of a soldier's uniform, he was given a prison sentence of 3 years to be served in a colony, where the line between punishment and survival blurred. During his time behind bars, Coleman discovered an unexpected passion: tailoring. He was assigned to the colony's sewing factory, and he found himself captivated by the intricate process of crafting garments. Stitch by stitch, he immersed himself in the discipline. He was determined to build a future once he got outside the prison walls. But as he honed his skills, something else was taking shape in his mind. Prison was more than just a place of punishment. It was a breeding ground for dark ideas. Among his fellow inmates, he absorbed stories, tales of crime, power, and manipulation. But one story in particular really took root in his mind. His cellmate, imprisoned for abducting homeless individuals, boasted of how he forced them to paint famous landmarks, selling the artwork for his own profit. The ability to control others so completely, to strip them of their freedom for his own personal gain, fascinated Coleman. It was a revelation. Power wasn't just about money, it was about control. But at this stage, it was just a fantasy. By the time he was released in 1974, his ambition had transformed. He enrolled in a technical college, earning a diploma in fashion design and tailoring, hoping to carve out an honest life. But the harsh economic reality of his hometown crushed that dream. There was simply no work in this industry. No jobs, no opportunities, no future. Coleman took on whatever he could find. None of it was what he wanted to do, but for a time, he worked as a security guard. And it was during a night shift that he met Alexander Mikhaev, who was an engineer struggling just as much as he was. 2 men connected through their hardship and dreams for a better life, and they would pitch business ideas to each other, and soon they would become business partners in the most sinister of ways. Amidst the struggle of daily hardship, Coleman's mind kept returning to a story that had never left him, one that his former cellmate had told him, the man who had enslaved the homeless, forcing them into labor for his own profit. The idea lingered in his mind. Maybe this was not such a bad idea, he began to think. One evening, he spoke to Mikhaev, revealing 2 dark business proposals. First, to force captives to grow berries and vegetables in a greenhouse, selling the product at the market. The second, to farm black cats for their fur, crafting keychains to sell alongside fashionable fur coats, a trend that was high in demand at the time. The horror of these suggestions would have repulsed most, but Mikhaev didn't flinch. He agreed. Bound by desperation and an utter lack of morality, the 2 men began to make their plans a reality. They called it the Greenhouse Project. Coleman had a garage, number 108, tucked away in a small row of private garages. At first, it seemed like the perfect place to begin their evil business. But then came the realization that keeping people captive in a garage was risky. Their screams could easily attract attention. So, the plan evolved. Instead of using the garage itself, they would build a hidden bunker beneath it, transforming it into an underground prison. Construction took 4 years, and to avoid suspicion, they did most of their work under the cover of night. Yet, As the bunker took shape, Coleman's vision grew even more grotesque. He no longer referred to it as a greenhouse. Now he called it the dungeon. It could have been one room underneath the garage, but Coleman wanted to keep digging. He spent lots of money on materials, and he made multiple rooms. His goal was to eventually build an underground city. By the end of 1994, their dungeon was complete. The chambers stretched 8 to 9 meters beneath the earth, hidden beneath an ordinary garage. The only way in or out was a ladder rigged with a lethal 220-volt charge, ensuring no escape. To smother any cries for help, triple doors sealed the underground prison. The walls were lined with mattresses to absorb every scream, every desperate plea, until silence was absolute. Inside, the bunker was set up like a textile factory, with rows of sewing machines, work tables, and everything ready for the forced labourers they would soon imprison. With their dungeon complete, Coleman and Mikhaev took the final step. They went hunting. Out on the streets, in the dead of night, they searched for the women who would become their slaves. During the early 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet economy had left millions of people out of work. There were many desperate people about, and plenty of people for Coleman and Mikhaev to prey on. The duo knew exactly what to look for. Their victims had to be reclusive, estranged from family, and desperate for work and unlikely to be missed. Lost souls who were easy to manipulate, easy to erase. For weeks, they prowled the streets of Polyani, hanging around train stations and marketplaces, watching and waiting. Patience was key. They needed the perfect target. Then, on December 11th, 1994, someone walked right up to them. It was a neighbour of Coleman's, Vera Tapilava, a 33-year-old woman. She approached Mikhaev asking for a cigarette. It began as just casual small talk, just a local woman asking about his day as they smoked together. Mikhaev joked with her and then asked her if she was looking for work. He already knew the answer, and he had seen the opportunity. He invited her for a drink and to meet his business partner, Coleman, and together they went to the garage. In this part of Russia, at the time, it was not unusual to drink in such a place. Vera saw no reason to refuse. She was delighted to accept. This could be her break. That evening, inside garage number 108, Coleman and Mikhaev welcomed her. They were jovial and drank shots of vodka, and it seemed like they were getting along great. It all seemed harmless, until it wasn't. Eventually, Coleman slipped a substance into Vera's drink, and it quickly took effect. Her vision blurred, her body weakened. She barely had time to register what was happening before she passed out, then placed her inside a large TV box and lowered her down into the dungeon. When Vera awoke, she was underground. The air was heavy, the walls were suffocating. Panic began to set in. She was trapped. Then Coleman stood over her. He told her straight that she was no longer free. She would work. She would obey. She was a prisoner, a slave, and no one was coming to save her. Vera did not give up. She tried to obey. She refused to be a slave. But over the next few days, she was starved, forced upon, beaten, and strangled with a hose. It was made clear that if she did not comply, then she would be simply killed. Vera by this point was terrified, and she agreed to every demand put on her. Outside, Vera's family did not report her missing, but despite the efforts of the police, they assumed that she was just another runaway, which wasn't uncommon. Vera was now trapped there, with no one looking for her. Terrifying. In the days that followed, Coleman wasted no time. He began to teach Vera how to use the sewing machine, along with the other skills required for the production of garments to be sold. Despite Coleman's best efforts to train her, no matter how many times he beat her or forced himself on her, Vera was simply not up to the task. She couldn't keep up with the precise movements required. Mistakes were piling up. The garments were flawed. She simply wasn't good enough. Frustration grew with Coleman and Mikhaev as time wore on. There was a fear that their heinous plan might unravel before it had even truly begun. Coleman, however, came up with another plan. He demanded Vera give him the name of someone who was good at tailoring, and under the weight of immense pressure, Vera suggested an old friend of hers, a woman she grew up with, who worked as a dressmaker from home. Her name was Tatiana Melenkova, a 35-year-old woman. Vera gave the address of Tatiana and Coleman went over. In early January of 1995, Coleman made his way to Tatiana's apartment and knocked on, saying he potentially had a lot of work for her, something that was hard to come by at the time. By a stroke of luck on Coleman's part, Tatiana's boyfriend was home, Nikolai Malik, a fellow cellmate during his time in prison. This legitimized Coleman's claims, and he couldn't believe his luck. He invited them both over for a casual drink to discuss the terms of the agreement with his business partner Mikhaev, and the couple were both thrilled to accept the invitation, and unsuspectingly, they joined Coleman for what appeared to be a harmless gathering. As the evening progressed, the conversation flowed, but then Coleman secretly administered the substance into their drinks, and quickly the paralyzing grip took hold, and in no time they were both unconscious. Tatiana was taken into the bunker. Meanwhile, Malik proved to be an issue. Coleman knew Malik was aggressive, and he knew that he would be a problem when he woke up. Coleman believed that Malik would never willingly submit to their will. Keeping him alive wasn't an option. So, Coleman and Mikhaev got rid of him. They stripped off his clothing and dumped him in a desolate frozen field. The brutal Russian winter would finish what they had started. To deceive the authorities, they left his clothes nearby. Officers knew that in extreme cold, hypothermia sometimes triggers paradoxical undressing, which is when the body is freezing. The person actually feels overheated and removes their clothes. It was the perfect cover. When Malik's body was discovered, police saw only a tragic accident. A drunken man lost in the snow, stripping off his clothes in his final moments before succumbing to the cold. They didn't see it as a murder, and just like that, Coleman and Mikhaev had gotten away with it. Tatiana's family reported her disappearance, but as in Vera's case, the investigation went nowhere. It appeared to the officers like the women had just vanished. I suppose that there was no way for them to know that they were being enslaved in a dungeon. Tatiana was forced to work 16-hour days. She made dressing gowns, underwear, and had to finish at least 32 bathrobes each day. This was grueling work. Vera could not help with the production of the garments, so instead she helped Tatiana with everything she needed and kept the bunker clean. The men also used Tatiana's body to pleasure themselves. Although they forced themselves on both women, it seemed more as Vera's job to do so more often. Vera and Tatiana were tormented by death threats and were fed menial food like potatoes, bread and water. Sometimes the women would not even get this, and they would be starved for days. They were only allowed to bathe once a week with a bucket of water shared between them, and they had another bucket to defecate in, and this bucket was only emptied once a week. And during all this, the beatings and essaying continued. For Coleman and Mikhaev, demand was booming for their product. The profits began to flow in, and the two men began to consider expanding their operation. Coleman wanted to dig more rooms. As of now, it was 3 rooms and a workshop, but he could not ask Vera to dig as she was too weak. and Tatiana had to keep up her grueling schedule. So Komin decided they needed a male captive, and so Komin and Mikhaev began their search. On the 21st of March 1995, they found Yevgeny Shishov, a 37-year-old homeless man who had been struggling with alcoholism and had fallen on hard times. As per their usual routine, they offered Yevgeny work, but first they wanted to chat in their garage to iron out the finer details of the job. Once there, they began to shop vodka, and once again one was laced with the substance, and before he knew it, Yevgeny woke up in the bunker, his legs and neck shackled. Komin told him that he was to dig in the bunker. They wanted to make room for another factory to expand their business, and that he would be working as a slave, and if he did not comply, he would be simply murdered. At first, like the others, Yevgeny was defiant. He refused to simply become a slave, but after a thorough beating, he soon became submissive. In an effort to demonstrate his usefulness, he revealed that he was a trained electrician with 4 years' experience. This news set off alarm bells in Komin's mind. With expertise in electronics, Yevgeny posed a significant risk. He had the capability to disable the power to the electrified ladders, which would lead to the escape of all the captives. This new information presented a significant complication for Komin, and one he would not overlook. Komin made the grim decision that Yevgeny had to die. His fate was sealed. Komin's cruelty knew no limits. After reading through reference books and technical materials, he decided the best way to kill him was with an electric chair, a device of absolute control, a machine of death. And so he built one. It was crude, yet horrifyingly effective. A simple wooden chair, stripped of all comfort, bare wires wrapped around, waiting for its victim. To activate it, 2 switches had to be flipped simultaneously, and Komin knew exactly who would switch them: his captive women. This was more than just execution. This was domination, a test of obedience, a way to break them completely. When the time came, Yevgeny was stripped naked, his wrists and ankles tightly bound, the wires dug into his skin. He was allowed a moment to make peace with what was happening. Then Komin turned to Vera and Tatiana. "Do it," he ordered. "Kill him." Tatiana refused. Even after everything, she would not become a murderer. But Vera obeyed. Due to the fear of what might happen if she didn't, she flipped the switches. The room filled with the stench of burning flesh. Yevgeny died instantly. His body was taken up to the ground floor in an isolated part of a forest. When his remains were eventually found, authorities knew of his history with alcohol. They dismissed it as an accidental death. No investigation, no suspicion. And once again, Komin had gotten away with murder. After this, Komin turned on Tatiana with ferocious violence for her defiance. He beat her to within an inch of her life, and now he started to favour Vera. He eventually began to trust her. Vera was not much use in the dungeon to Komin, so he decided to use her in a different way. She was allowed to leave the bunker, so long as she found him more people to enslave, or do any tasks that he asked of her. She would have to return in the evening, but this was better than staying in the bunker all the time. Tragically, she became instrumental in the continuation of their heinous cycle. On July 16th, 1995, 36-year-old Tatiana Kozikova found herself in the dungeon's grim confines. Despite holding a job, her wages were unreliable, and desperation had driven her to steal a cake for her daughter's birthday. She now had an upcoming court hearing for the theft, and she would likely receive a fine and possibly incarceration. When Vera, under the manipulation of her enslavement, offered her a job opportunity, Kozikova hoping to pay her way out of her legal troubles, quickly accepted. She was desperate, but what she didn't know was that she was being led into the depths of Komin's sinister lair. In a similar way to how Vera herself was ensnared, she approached Kuzakova, who was an old friend, and told her about a man who had plenty of work to offer. And it played out the same. They went to the garage, drank a shot of vodka, and before she knew it, she awoke in the dungeon. When Kuzakova awoke, she was deep inside the bunker, but she was different. Despite the harrowing conditions, despite Komin's brutal beatings, despite being forced upon, she refused to surrender. Her spirit remained unshaken, and she fought back. She was also a beacon of hope for Tatiana, who by then was slipping into despair. After now spending 6 months in the bunker, she was losing her will and spoke of ending it all. After all, in her mind, it would be better than what happened to Yevgeny. Kuzakova refused to let that happen. She made an amulet for Tatiana, which became a symbol of freedom. She wrote words of encouragement on the walls, small messages of defiance, promises that they will one day get out of this situation. Her strength was fueled by one thing, her daughter, and no matter what, she would see her again. Over the next few days, Tatiana showed Kuzakova how to make the robes and what was demanded of her. They both worked 16-hour days, non-stop, and at least 32 bathrobes a day were expected from each of them. While she was learning her new job, Kuzakova meticulously observed the bunker's layout, looking for any weaknesses. She noticed the electrified ladders, and she tried to find a way to cut the power to them. Realizing this was not possible, what she did notice was that each time Komin entered, he would disable the electrical system, unknowingly presenting them with a chance to escape. Kuzakova devised a plan with Tatiana. The next time he came down would be their chance to make a break for it. Once he came down, Kuzakova locked Komin in one of the rooms with a frying pan handle. This was now their chance of freedom. Both Tatiana and Kuzakova made their way up the ladders, but what neither of them knew was that there was a locked iron door at the top of the ladders, sealing them inside. They tried with everything they had to pry the door open, but they had no chance. Whilst this was happening, Komin broke down the door that kept him locked inside, and one by one he pulled the women down from the ladder. He was furious. How dare they try and escape? Not only would they ruin the business, but they would lead to his arrest. He administered serious punishment. He choked them with a hose, burned their hands with a large candle, and beat them till they nearly lost consciousness. He was looking around the dungeon and thinking, what could he beat them with next? The cruelty they both endured was horrific and shown the inhumanity of their captor. Komin then offered the women an ultimatum for punishment. They were to choose between having their mouths grotesquely slashed from ear to ear, like a Chelsea smile, or being branded with a tattoo with a Russian term meaning the word slave on their faces. Faced with this cruel choice, the women opted for the tattoo, a permanent reminder of their captivity, but one that spared them from further physical abuse. Komin tattooed the phrase on their foreheads and under their eyes. Tatiana would later say how the pain was unbearable when she was being tattooed below the eyes. This was done with crude instruments, so you can only imagine the pain. To stop any further attempts of escape, Komin resorted to even more extreme measures. He welded shackles to the bunker's walls, and each time before coming down the ladder, he would turn on a light. Once this came on, the women would have to put the shackles around their necks and throw the keys on the floor in front of them, ensuring their complete helplessness. Under these horrific conditions, the production of garments continued relentlessly. Tatiana laboured to the point of exhaustion, barely sleeping or eating, but business was doing well, and Komin wanted to add yet another slave. He sent Vera to go and find someone, but unexpectedly, when Vera left this time, she did not return. But Comyn wasn't worried. He felt confident that the terror instilled in Vera was enough to silence her forever. He believed that no matter where she fled, she wouldn't dare expose him, so he made no effort to find her. His assumption proved correct. Vera chose not to reveal the horrors she had endured. She attempted to disappear into a new life, leaving the other captives alone to face the brutalities without any hope of being rescued. With Vera now gone, Comyn and Mikhaev spoke again about what to do, and as usual, the plan was to search for more captives. Comyn set his sights on markets and train stations again, and in early 1996, he encountered a young woman who fit his vile criteria. She was shy, had a nice figure, and looked desperate. Comyn began talking to her. He lured her to the garage with the promise of food and a place to rest, and most importantly, employment. His method was the same: a drink laced with substances, followed by abduction to the bunker. The latest victim of this horrific plan was 27-year-old Tatiana Nazimov, who, unbeknownst to Comyn, was struggling mentally, having fled her home years prior due to her issues with it. Despite his efforts to train her on the sewing machines and garment making, Nazimov lacked the skill and mental ability for tailoring. Comyn did have some use for her still. She would simply become his intimate slave. She would have to please Comyn and Mikhaev whenever they chose. A horrific existence. But Comyn still needed labor, so he again went out in search of a new slave. It was then that Comyn, whilst wandering the markets, bumped into Vera. He was happy to see her. They spoke. Vera must have been terrified, but Comyn seemed unfazed that she had run away from the bunker. Not only this, he made her an offer. He said that if she came back to work for him, he would give her a cut of the sales. All she had to do was keep the bunker a secret and run occasional errands for him. Vera, still living a very poor lifestyle, agreed, and even offered to bring a new slave to show her loyalty. Their next captive was 22-year-old Irina Gudaskina, a young mother who had been desperately trying to find a flat to rent with her boyfriend. She went alone to view an apartment where she met Vera, who claimed she was handling the lease for the landlord. Irina was struggling to find steady employment. Her lack of education and limited work experience made securing a job almost impossible. Vera quickly saw this vulnerability and exploited it, promising Irina that she knew someone who could offer her work. Irina, hopeful and trusting, took the drink Vera offered, unaware it had substances in it, and almost immediately she passed out. Vera and Comyn together moved her body into the darkness of the bunker. When Irina woke up hours later, she was in a state of panic, but then she noticed Mikhaev. They had literally played together when they were young. Relief flooded through her as she pleaded desperately for his help, certain he would save her. But instead of rescue, Mikhaev betrayed her in the cruelest way, violently forcing himself upon her. The betrayal must have been devastating, but the horror didn't stop there. Comyn never intended to keep Vera around. After she brought Irina to him, he wanted no partners to share his profits. She had served her purpose, and now he planned to make an example of her, to instill fear into the remaining captives. He tied Vera tightly onto a table, usually used for sewing garments, gagged her mouth, and began pushing needles deep beneath her fingernails whilst beating on her. The pain was unbearable, so intense that Vera slipped in and out of consciousness. But Comyn wasn't finished yet. He handed Tatiana a syringe filled with antifreeze and ordered her to inject it into Vera. Tatiana froze, not wanting to do it, yet terrified of what might happen if she refused. So Tatiana tried, but she could not find the vein. Then Vera offered to drink it herself. Coleman agreed and poured a glass of the substance. Vera drank it, but it was not enough. She had to ask for more. For 15 agonizing hours, Vera's body was ravaged by the poison until she finally succumbed. Once she was dead, Coleman and Mikhaev casually dumped her body into a nearby river, ending yet another life and covering their tracks once again. By March 1997, Tatiana Nazimov's health had severely deteriorated. She was suffering badly with the symptoms of her leukemia and the worsening state of her mental health. Nazimov desperately needed professional medical care, something impossible to obtain within Coleman's dungeon. To him, Tatiana had become a liability. The other captives begged Coleman for mercy, pleading that he release her for treatment. They argued that in her fragile state, nobody would believe her if she spoke out. But Coleman was unmoved by the compassion. He saw only risk. Determined to eliminate the threat she posed, Coleman cruelly starved Nazimov for days, watching her weaken to the brink of death. When her condition was critical, he injected her with antifreeze, ending her life in a final, painful way. Nazimov's remains were planned to be taken during the night to a local morgue, but on the way, Coleman noticed some people heading in his direction, so he simply dumped the body in some nearby bushes, where her remains were discovered that very morning. And although the authorities notified her family, her troubled history and life on the streets caused them to quickly conclude that her death was simply due to her untreated illnesses. Once again, no investigation was launched. Another life lost, another crime hidden in plain sight. Back in the bunker, Coleman's fascination with Irina gradually evolved into a distorted form of romance. She was young, seemingly compliant, exactly what Coleman desired. After Nazimov's death, he did something he'd never done before. He threw a small celebration within the bunker, bringing sweets and treats in an attempt to charm Irina. Irina was terrified, but she quickly found herself faced with a critical choice. The other captives begged her to play along, seeing it as their only chance at survival and perhaps eventually escape. Reluctantly, Irina agreed. She began writing poems filled with longing and love, that Coleman, in his delusion, thought were written about him. When Coleman read her poems, he was deeply moved. They brought him to tears. He cried in Irina's arms and told her that no one had ever written a poem for him before. He fell obsessively in love with her. He began to come to the bunker every day, but not only for work, but also for dates with Irina. All the while, the other women are slaving away, seeing it all, and Coleman and Irina would have intimacy in one of the rooms. But as they did, Coleman would place a mirror so he could see the other women at all times, to make sure there were no attempts of escape. Soon, believing that Irina was genuinely the one, he began revealing his horrific master plan, a nightmarish underground kingdom of enslaved women, forced to bear his children generation after generation. He envisioned Irina at his side, his official wife and queen. Obsessed with conceiving a child, Coleman repeatedly assaulted Irina, resorting to grotesque methods like artificial insemination, using a turkey baster when natural efforts failed. Using her growing influence, Irina convinced him that the bunker was no place to conceive or raise offspring, and that they needed somewhere else, somewhere better. I played along, Irina said. Almost immediately, he confessed his love and told me he wanted us to marry. I saw a chance and bargained with him. I said if I married him, he had to stop hurting the other women, even if they failed to meet his expectations. To my surprise, he agreed. He started bringing us normal food and even asked Tatiana to sew me a beautiful dress. I didn't even have my own clothes. He began taking me upstairs occasionally, letting me breathe fresh air again, but he quickly warned me not to scream. No one will hear you anyway, he told me. So I made the painful choice to play along, pretending to care for someone who was a murderer, a man who forced himself on women, a complete maniac. It was unbearable, but I knew it was the only way to survive. He kept pressing me, repeatedly asking if I loved him. Somehow, I kept saying yes. To this day, I still don't know how he never suspected a thing. By April 1997, Coleman had become so convinced by Irina's act that he decided to take her out of the bunker altogether. He brought her to live with him in his flat. Suddenly, Irina's nightmare continued in the open, disguised as a normal life. To understand how surreal this was, you have to picture Coleman's life outside the bunker. He was completely mundane, no job, living on benefits, and sharing a flat with others who knew nothing about the monster he was. His family and friends had absolutely no idea of the horrors he was hiding. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, he brings this young woman to live with him. Coleman kept a constant watch over Irina, never giving her a single moment alone. He monitored every word she spoke to family and friends, forcing her to maintain the facade that everything was perfectly fine. One day, while out walking together, the new couple ran into Irina's parents. Coleman immediately put the charm on, acting polite and well-mannered. He even suggested they all get together soon to become properly acquainted. Not long after, they met at Irina's parents' house, but before they arrived, Coleman made a chilling threat. He carried a knife and warned Irina that if she didn't convincingly play along, he'd murder her parents right in front of her before ending her life as well. At the gathering, Coleman asked Irina's parents for their blessing to marry their daughter, putting on a show of sincerity and warmth. But he didn't stop there. Manipulating them further, he persuaded them to grant him custody of Irina's 2-year-old daughter, who had been living with Irina's parents. He convinced them that they were going to be a happy family, and Coleman moved from his property into a smaller one, so the three of them could live together as a real family. Irina's daughter quickly started calling Coleman Dad. Irina must have been seething inside, but she had to play along. As their wedding day approached, Coleman bought Irina's dress, and the date was set. But fate intervened. Unexpectedly, Irina's grandfather passed away, and with Coleman being deeply superstitious, he took it as a bad omen and decided to postpone the ceremony. In this delay, perhaps lay a tiny glimmer of hope for Irina. Irina's desperation to escape grew by the day, especially as Coleman revealed more of his horrifying plans for the women still trapped in the bunker. She had been preparing their meals, which Coleman took down to the dungeon, but one day he demanded she poison their food. He wanted them dead. He no longer wanted the bunker and wanted to live a normal family life, even though his version was in the most twisted of circumstances. Irina refused outright, defying him despite the danger, but Coleman had already anticipated this. He revealed his backup plan, which was even more terrifying. He intended to bury the women alive, filling the bunker with soil, leaving them trapped underground, suffocating in darkness. Irina knew she was running out of time. She had to find a way, and fast. Irina's chance finally came on July 21st, 1997. Coleman had gone to the hospital for a minor operation, meaning for just a few precious hours, Irina and her daughter were essentially free, something they had been waiting so long to experience. All those unbearable days and nights of pretending to love a monster, a murderer, a maniac, had finally paid off. Irina knew she had to take this opportunity. Without hesitation, she took her daughter and rushed straight to the police station. As I described at the start of this video, officers initially dismissed her story as a wild fantasy until she began listing the names of other missing people, her fellow captives. Suddenly, they took her seriously. Irina quickly revealed everything: where to find Coleman, the exact location of the hidden dungeon, and crucially, that the ladders leading down were rigged with lethal electric currents and explosives. She warned the officers that if they went down without disarming them, not only would they die, but the captives and the entire dungeon would be destroyed. Police arrested Coleman at the hospital, taking him immediately to the bunker. At first, he insisted it was all fantasy, but when they brought him to the garage, he casually encouraged the officers to climb down, knowing full well the trap that awaited them below. In his mind, he thought that if the officers went down and the explosives went off, he could have a chance to make an escape. But the officers were not fooled and demanded he disable all the traps immediately. Moments later, Tatiana and Kuzakova emerged, stepping into daylight for the first time in 2 agonizing years, as they took their first breaths of fresh air. At long last, their nightmare in the dungeon had come to an end, but tragically, their struggles didn't end with freedom. The next part is perhaps the saddest part of the entire case for me. After Tatiana and Kuzakova were rescued, police issued a public plea, hoping to raise around $400 for the removal of the humiliating tattoos branded onto the women's faces. But no one donated, partly because many people were financially struggling at the time, but also due to a lack of empathy. Much of the public even believed that these women were somehow responsible for the crimes themselves. Instead of compassion, Tatiana and Kuzakova were met with suspicion and rejection. They were never recognized as the true victims they were. Unable to find work, the women resorted to begging on the streets, doing whatever they could to simply survive. No one would hire them. They had become permanently marked by their horrific experiences. A few years later, Tatiana's struggle ended in tragedy. She was discovered dead in a back alley, having succumbed to exposure whilst desperately sleeping amongst piles of rubbish in an attempt to stay warm. Yet out of this tragedy, something good emerged. Tatiana's death made national headlines, and a famous Russian singer heard about their plight. Moved by their story, she located Kuzakova, paid for her tattoo removal, and provided her with a place to live. But heartbreakingly, just a couple of years later, Kuzakova died of a sudden heart attack. Both women passed away within 7 short years of escaping the dungeon. Irina fared better. Despite enormous difficulties, she managed to rebuild her life, securing a job and home for herself and her daughter. Over time, she recovered, and today she enjoys the love of her supportive family. Coleman, however, revealed his true cowardice after his arrest. At first, he claimed he had been helping these women. He said, and quote, "These were unemployed, homeless women. I gave them a place to live and a steady job." He was painting himself as some kind of savior. He continued, "Every day I had to think about them, think about feeding them." When this version of events failed, he quickly changed tactics, blaming Mikhaev, claiming he'd been forced into everything, fearing Mikhaev would murder his family if he refused. The truth left Coleman's family and friends in complete shock. They couldn't comprehend that the quiet, seemingly ordinary man they thought they knew had been hiding such horrific secrets. In June 1999, Alexander Coleman was sentenced to life imprisonment for his crimes, while Mikhaev received a 20-year sentence. Coleman said during the trial, and quote, "Of course, such a crazy idea would not come to a normal man, but still, I think I am normal. Just 1 month after the sentencing, Coleman ended everything in his prison cell. This is truly one of the most horrific and bizarre cases I have heard. I'm just glad that Arena found some happiness in the end. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay sane.